At night, when the darkness settles softly over the old fields of England, like a thin blanket stretching across a forgotten landscape, I always feel time loosening its grip. It stops behaving like minutes and seconds, and instead becomes something quieter, something that drifts around me like a low mist. And it is in these late and gentle hours that I return to one of the oldest stories I carry, the story of a man who stepped into history with heavy, deliberate footsteps, reshaping an entire kingdom with a will that refused to bend. His name was William I, known to the world as William the Conqueror, and I still remember the first time I read about him. It felt as though his shadow entered the room where I sat, bringing with it the salt wind of Normandy, the memory of a battlefield, and the calm certainty of someone who understood exactly what he was about to change. I never picture his arrival in England as the usual dramatic storm of clashing weapons and shouting soldiers. To me, he walks off his ship in silence, sometime in the autumn of the year 1066, standing for a moment on the damp shore and looking toward the misty hills before him. I imagine the faint crackle of campfires behind him, the rustle of fabric, the shifting of armor, and the muted anticipation of hundreds of men waiting for the dawn that would decide their fate. In my mind, the Battle of Hastings does not roar. It murmurs. It feels distant, softened by the fog of centuries, like the muffled echo of hooves pressing into wet earth, the quiet clink of metal brushing metal, the uneven breathing of men who know they may fall before the sun sets. In this half-dream state, the battle becomes less an act of violence and more a strange kind of tide, washing William toward the throne he believed was rightfully his. When William finally becomes king, I always sense my own breathing slowing, matching the weight of his intentions. He did not rule like a man chasing glory. He ruled like a man constructing something that needed to last longer than himself. The stone castles he ordered into existence, the Tower of London, the fortress at Winchester, the strongholds at York, do not appear in my mind as symbols of fear or domination. They appear as dim lanterns pricking the dark, each stone he laid marking the beginning of a new rhythm in the country he now controlled. I imagine the thick walls slowly rising under gray skies, the smell of wet mortar, the steady hands of builders, and the quiet sense that England was being carved into a new shape without anyone fully realizing it yet. And then there is the Domesday Book, which I never think of as a dry administrative record. To me, it has always felt like a massive diary of an entire nation's memory. I picture the scribes sitting under flickering candlelight in the year 1086, dipping quills into ink, their breaths visible in the cold air, while they documented every field, every animal, every household they could reach. Sometimes I wonder if they knew what they were doing, that their careful handwriting would survive for nearly 1,000 years, that they were creating a mirror for a future they could not imagine. There is something strangely tender in that image, as though each name recorded in the book was a heartbeat they wanted to preserve. When William dies in the year 1087, the room I sit in always becomes quieter. Not because his death was tragic or dramatic, but because it was unexpectedly human. A man who made an entire kingdom tremble left the world not with trumpets or banners, but in a silence that feels almost humble. I picture him lying still, surrounded by the dimness of a medieval chamber, and the idea that even someone who reshaped a country must eventually surrender to the same stillness that awaits everyone. It is a strangely comforting thought. And whenever I reach the end of this part of the story, I let the silence linger a little before I move on. The image of William I fades gently into the darker corners of memory, stepping aside for the next figure who emerges from the shadow of the crown. In the softened glow of the nighttime, William II begins to appear, carrying with him the strange and unsettling tale of a king who died not on a battlefield, nor in his palace, but deep within a forest where sunlight filtered through the leaves like broken pieces of gold. His death, sudden, quiet, and surrounded by trees, always reminds me that royal power has never been a shield against the unpredictable hand of fate. As I sit in the dimness of my own room, telling this story in the slow rhythm of nighttime, I always end with the same lingering feeling that history is not a collection of dates and battles, but a series of silent footsteps passing through the dark, leaving impressions that glow softly long after the figures themselves have vanished. There is a certain heaviness that always settles over me when I begin to think about William II, as though I am stepping into a forest long before anyone tells me why I am there. It is not the kind of darkness that frightens, but the kind that presses softly on the skin and forces me to listen a little more closely, a little more patiently, as if the trees themselves are holding a story they do not share easily. After William I fades from my mind, I feel the shadow of his son appear like a flicker of red in the corner of my vision. For William II was called William Rufus, the Red King, a title that somehow mirrors the restless flame that seems to burn through every account of his reign. And as I settle into the quiet of my own room, I can almost sense the temperature rise just a little, as though the presence of this king brings with it a heat that never quite belonged to the cool nights of England. I always imagine him standing in the great hall, his hair catching the firelight, his voice sharp even when he does not intend it to be, his court watching him with the uneasy awareness that his temper could flare at any moment. Historians often describe him as fierce, impulsive, and headstrong, but in the softened rhythm of evening, I do not see him as a tyrant. I see him as a man who carried too much fire inside himself, so much that it crackled beneath his skin and made everyone around him step a little too carefully. Even now, as I think about him, there is something unsettled in the air, as though the story of this king cannot be approached without feeling the tension that once clung to him like a cloak. His reign, beginning in the year 1087, always feels to me like a storm that never quite breaks. England grows stronger and more centralized under his command, yet that strength seems to rest uneasily on the shoulders of a king who never allows the atmosphere around him to calm. I picture the corridors of his court filled with hurried footsteps, whispered conversations, and glances exchanged between men who fear that a single careless word could cost them favor. There is a strange rhythm to it, a kind of breathless anticipation, as though everyone is waiting for something unnamed and inevitable. Perhaps that is why, whenever I recall the story of William Rufus, I feel myself bracing without knowing exactly what for. But the memory that defines him, the one that lingers long after the details of his governance fade, belongs not to a throne room or a battlefield, but to the forest. And before I reach that moment, I always feel the room around me shift just slightly. The air grows still, the pace of the night slows, because the death of William II is not simply a historical event. It is a story that shivers through time, wrapped in mystery, whispered by leaves and shadows rather than chroniclers. I have retold it many times, yet each time feels like walking down a narrow path lined with tall trees, knowing that something is waiting for me at the end. It was the year 1100, a late afternoon in the depths of New Forest, where the light filtered through the dense canopy and the thin golden strands. I picture the forest floor soft beneath the hooves of horses, the distant flutter of birds disturbed by the presence of hunters, and the sharp sound of bowstrings drawn tight. William rode with several companions, though their names feel pale compared to the looming shape of the forest itself. Hunting, for him, was not leisure. It was an act of release, a way to let the tension inside him bleed into the wildness around him. Whenever I reach this point in the story, I always lean back slightly, slowing my breath, because everything that happens next feels suspended in a strange, dreamlike pause. The sun is lowering, the shadows lengthen, a bowstring is pulled, a moment hangs in the air like dust caught in a sunbeam. And then the arrow. It is said to have flown from the bow of Walter Tyrrell, though no one ever truly knew whether it was an accident or something darker. Some claim it ricocheted from a tree, others whisper of betrayal, of politics, of ambition. But in my retelling, I focus on only one thing: the silence that follows. I imagine the arrow striking William in the chest, the sound muted by the thick forest. There is no screaming, no desperate call, only the sudden collapse of a body that had carried so much fire. I see him fall to the ground, the leaves cushioning his weight, the red of his blood blending with the red of his reputation. The forest absorbs the moment completely, swallowing the noise the way it swallows the wind. Death, when it comes in a place like that, seems almost gentle. It is the reaction of the living that feels harsh, because the hunters scattered. They fled into the trees, leaving their king lying in the fading light, alone among the roots and moss. Whenever I reach this part of the story, I feel something tighten in my chest, a strange, quiet ache at the thought of a king abandoned by those who swore loyalty to him. And then I remind myself that fear makes cowards of even the bravest men. In the year 1100, the death of a king in a forest was not just a personal tragedy, it was a political earthquake, and no one wanted to be caught beneath the falling stones. In my mind, the night grows colder as his body remains there, waiting to be found, waiting to be carried away by a charcoal burner who, according to the stories, placed the king's corpse on a cart and brought him back to Winchester. There is something deeply human about that image, a humble worker, far removed from courtly life, bearing the weight of a monarch whose temper and power once seemed unshakable. It makes me think about how little all of us truly control, how quickly a life, even a royal life, can slip into the quiet hands of fate. And yet, as William Rufus disappears into the shadows of memory, I always sense another figure stepping forward, emerging from the same forest with a purpose shaped by opportunity. Henry, the younger brother, stood close enough to the scene to seize the moment. Before William's body even cooled, Henry was already riding toward Winchester, claiming the treasury, securing the crown, and steering England toward a future that would belong to him alone. His path begins where William's ends, in the forest, in its silent and indifferent way, becomes the hinge between their destinies. As I sit with this story deep into the night, I often find myself thinking less about kings and more about the strange quietness of endings. William II did not fall in battle, nor in rebellion, nor in the chaos of political upheaval. He fell in a forest, under filtered sunlight, with only the trees as witnesses. And it reminds me that history does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers through branches and rustling leaves, leaving us to wonder, centuries later, what truly happened beneath the canopy of New Forest in the year 1100. And when the story begins to fade from my thoughts, I allow the silence to settle again, preparing the way for Henry I, whose steady presence waits patiently at the edge of memory, ready to step forward in the next chapter of this long, drifting journey through 1,000 years of England's crown. When I let the silence settle after William II fades into the dark of New Forest, I always feel another presence waiting just outside the edge of memory, steady and patient, as though he has been standing there all along. And so the transition feels natural, almost inevitable, when Henry steps forward. It is Henry I who now fills the quiet, not with fire like his brother, nor with the heavy force of conquest like his father, but with something calmer and more deliberate, something that moves through the night the way ink moves across parchment. After the chaos of a king falling to an arrow in a forest, Henry's arrival feels like the slow exhale the kingdom desperately needed. And as I shift my thoughts to him, I feel the room around me steady itself. In my mind, he emerges from the dimness of that forest path, not as a man stumbling into opportunity, but as someone who has been preparing for this moment in the quiet corners of his life. The year is 1100, and before William's body has even cooled among the leaves, Henry has already begun shaping the future. I often imagine him riding from New Forest with a strange mix of grief and resolve, knowing that the crown he is about to claim carries with it not only power, but the heavy responsibility of restoring order to a realm worn thin by tension and unpredictability. His horse moves quickly, hooves cutting into the damp earth, the forest receding behind him like an old memory, while Winchester with its treasury, its clergy, and the keys to England's fate draws closer with every breath. There is something almost soothing about Henry's mind, at least as I picture it in the late hours of the night. He is not a man of sudden flares or reckless impulses. He is methodical, grounded, almost mathematical in the way he approaches the throne. When he secures the treasury and claims the crown, He does so with a quiet certainty that feels like a stone settling into place, and the kingdom reacts not with fear, but with relief. In these retellings, I always sense England itself exhaling, grateful for a king whose emotions do not scorch the air around him. One of the first things Henry does is issue the Charter of Liberties, a document that has echoed faintly through the centuries and often returns to me in the calm of the night. I picture the year 1101 like a candlelit room filled with clergy and nobles, their faces flickering with expectation as Henry speaks words that promise fairness, restraint, and respect for the customs of the land. The Charter, as I have come to see it, is not simply a proclamation. It is Henry lowering his voice so the entire kingdom can hear him clearly for the first time. It is his way of smoothing the sharp edges left behind by earlier reigns, telling England that he intends to rule with balance rather than fire. Whenever I reach this part of his story, I often find myself dwelling on the idea of order, not the rigid kind enforced by fear, but the gentle kind that allows people to breathe more freely. Henry strengthens the royal treasury with the precision of a man who understands numbers as well as he understands people. And I imagine him walking through the financial chambers of his administration with the same slow, thoughtful steps one might take through a library. He restores discipline among officials, brings structure to the legal system, and lays foundations that will influence England long after he is gone. It feels, in a strange way, like watching someone quietly repair a house that had begun to tilt under the weight of its own history. But the moments that linger with me the most do not come from the throne rooms or the documents or the reforms. They come from the tender edges of Henry's personal life, especially the day he receives the devastating news of his son's death. The White Ship disaster of the year 1120 is a story that has haunted many, and each time I revisit it, my breath slows. I imagine the dark waves of the Channel swallowing the ship, the cries lost to the wind, and the Prince William Etheling slipping beneath the cold water, taking Henry's hopes for a stable succession with him. Whenever I picture Henry learning of this tragedy, I always sense a deep, quiet fracture opening inside him, the kind that does not scream but changes everything. Even the strongest rulers are not protected from grief, and in that moment Henry feels painfully human. The weight he carries from that night forward is the weight of a man who has seen the future he planned sink into the sea, leaving him with the unresolved dread of dynastic uncertainty. And because I tell these stories in the calm of the night, I often find myself imagining Henry standing alone in a chamber, lit by a single torch, the shadows trembling as though they, too, are mourning the loss. Yet despite the grief, he continues to rule with the same steady hand, shaping England with an almost stubborn sense of responsibility. His reign stretches from the year 1100 to the year 1135, and though time passes, I always sense the lingering ache beneath his restraint, a quiet sorrow that he tucks into the folds of his public life. It is this combination strength on the outside, sorrow on the inside that makes him feel different from the kings who came before and after him. As the story of Henry I begins to fade into the background of my thoughts, I feel the familiar softness of transition returning, the way it always does when one chapter ends and another prepares to step forward. For when Henry's life reaches its final winter, and his grief and discipline finally give way to silence, England enters a period of turmoil so thick and uncertain that even my own breathing slows whenever I think of it. His death in the year 1135 does not bring clarity. Instead, it opens a door to a bitter struggle for the throne, a civil war so chaotic that history remembers it simply as the anarchy. And as Henry's presence dissolves into the dim corners of memory, I feel the shadow of the next figure, his nephew Stephen, emerging with a hesitant and uneasy glow, ready to lead England into a chapter filled with disorder, conflict, and a kind of restless darkness that will define the tone of Part 4. When the memory of Henry I finally drifts into the distance, leaving behind the faint echo of discipline and grief, I always feel a subtle trembling in the air, as though the ground beneath the story is shifting before my mind fully understands why. And then, almost like a dim lantern swinging at the end of a long corridor, Stephen appears. His face never arrives with certainty. It always comes with hesitation, with that uneasy flicker one sees in a man who steps forward because no one else has stepped fast enough. The year is 1135, and as I sink deeper into the quiet of the night, I sense the kingdom slipping into a kind of fog the moment Henry's life ends. A fog so thick that even now I inhale as if the air around me has grown heavier. Stephen's claim to the throne feels less like a grand declaration and more like a hurried gesture made in the middle of a storm. I imagine him riding toward London with urgency rather than triumph, his cloak whipped by wind, his thoughts tangled between opportunity and fear. The nobles, weary of the stern discipline of Henry and wary of the unknown future, place the crown upon Stephen's head before Henry's daughter, the Empress Matilda, can secure her own rightful claim. In my retelling, this moment always carries a sense of imbalance, like a scale tipped too quickly, before anyone has checked what rests on either side. And as the crown rests on Stephen's brow, I feel England exhale not with relief but with uncertainty, like a house whose foundation has begun to shift. Whenever I try to describe the early years of Stephen's reign, I feel myself slowing down even further, because everything in this period seems blurred at the edges. Nothing moves with direction. Nothing holds its shape. It is as though the kingdom has become a great tapestry left in the rain, the threads loosening and the colors bleeding into one another. Stephen is not a cruel man, nor an unfeeling one. He is simply a king lacking the firm hand required to hold a fragile nation together. His kindness becomes weakness. His generosity becomes inconsistency. And the nobles, sensing the softness behind his decisions, begin to drift away from him like leaves pulled from a branch by an autumn wind. I often picture England in these years as a landscape full of dimly lit manors, their windows glowing at night while inside. Lords whisper among themselves, debating loyalties, weighing advantages, and waiting for a moment to choose the side that benefits them most. It is in those quiet rooms, surrounded by flickering candlelight and restless ambitions, that the seed of civil war begins to grow. And when Matilda finally asserts her claim, the kingdom fractures. The conflict that follows. The anarchy has a name that sounds almost dramatic, but in my mind it unfolds like a long winter storm, more numbing than violent, more exhausting than catastrophic. The years drift from the year 1135 toward the year 1154, and I always picture this stretch of time as a night without sunrise, an era where no one truly wins and everyone slowly weakens. Castles change hands again and again, like pieces moved across a board by hands too impatient to think clearly. Roads become unsafe. Villages shrink into silence. Farmers harvest by looking over their shoulders. Even the nobles grow tired, their wealth drained by the endless shifting of alliances. And through it all, Stephen and Matilda struggle for a crown that seems less a symbol of power and more a burden carried by two people unable to put it down. There are certain images from this period that linger with me whenever I revisit it in the depth of night. I see Stephen imprisoned in the year 1141, then released in a swift reversal that feels more like a breath than a chapter. I see Matilda entering London with hope simmering under her composure, only to be driven out again by a city that refuses to accept her. I see Henry of Anjou, Matilda's son, waiting in the wings, his youth overshadowed by the fatigue that has settled over England like dust. It is a strange and weary dance, full of movements that seem to go nowhere and leave no one satisfied. The worst part of these years, at least in my imagination, is the sense of abandonment felt by ordinary people. Chroniclers wrote that Christ and his saints slept, a line that returns to me often, especially when the world outside my window is quiet enough for me to hear the echo of distant centuries. It is a phrase that makes me feel the weight of those years more than any account of battles or sieges. It speaks of a kingdom left without guidance, without comfort, without the steady rhythm that had once allowed its people to breathe with ease. And I imagine the roads scattered with broken wagons, fields left half-plowed, doors barred early, and prayers whispered without conviction. Yet even within the heaviness of the anarchy, there is a soft turning point, a moment when the long night begins to pull back. I picture Stephen in the later years of his reign, his face lined with the exhaustion of a struggle that has lasted too long, his eyes carrying the reflection of a country worn thin. When his son Eustace dies in the year 1153, I always sense a deep shift inside him. Not sudden, not sharp, but gradual, like the loosening of a knot that has been pulled too tight. It is then that the idea of peace with Matilda's son Henry begins to take shape, as though Stephen finally understands that the crown must pass not to another generation of conflict, but to someone who can rebuild what has been fractured. And so, in the Treaty of Wallingford, Stephen names Henry of Anjou as his heir, allowing the kingdom a path toward daylight after nearly 2 decades of darkness. When Stephen dies in the year 1154, I always imagine England pausing, not in grief, but in relief, a long, trembling breath released after holding too much inside for too long. His reign does not end with triumph nor failure, but with a kind of weary surrender that lets the country gather its scattered pieces. As the final traces of Stephen's presence dissolve into the quiet of my thoughts, I feel the first hints of a new stability beginning to form, carried by the steady and determined figure who will step into the story next. Henry II, young, energetic, and fiercely intelligent, enters the memory as though he is pushing open a heavy door that has not moved in many years. The kingdom, tired but hopeful, prepares to wake again, when the long, weary twilight of Stephen's reign dissolves and the last tremors of the anarchy fade into stillness. I always feel the story shift in a way that is almost physical, like the first hint of warmth after a winter that overstayed its welcome. And it is in that soft, almost imperceptible shift that Henry II enters my thoughts. He does not burst into history. Instead, he arrives with the steady confidence of someone who has been waiting outside the door of the kingdom for too long, listening to the chaos inside and preparing himself to confront it. The year is 1154, and when Henry steps forward, I imagine England lifting its head slowly, cautiously, as though afraid that the calm he brings might vanish if touched too quickly. I often picture him very young at this moment, his energy taut like a bowstring, his mind already calculating what must be mended first. He is the son of the Empress Matilda, the grandson of Henry I, and he carries in him both the memory of order and the memory of loss. When I sit in the quiet of my room, letting the story unfold, I see him riding through the countryside that had suffered under nearly 2 decades of uncertainty, the land marked by abandoned fields, unstable castles, and villages that had grown accustomed to looking over their shoulders. And yet, with each step of his horse, something in the air seems to mend slightly, as though the land recognizes him, as though the kingdom is whispering that perhaps, at last, someone has come to hold it together again. Henry's rule does not begin with spectacle. It begins with repair. I imagine him studying the shattered structure of government the way a patient craftsman studies a broken clock. He does not panic. He does not rush. He works with the careful movements of someone who understands that a kingdom is not conquered through force alone. It must be maintained through rhythm. And so he begins to restore order piece by piece, strengthening the royal treasury, reining in unruly nobles, and setting into motion the judicial reforms that will eventually make England's legal system one of the most defining legacies of his reign. Whenever I think of these early years, I always see Henry bent over a table, candlelight flickering across parchment, the soft scratch of quill against vellum echoing like a heartbeat through the halls of the palace. But the part of Henry's story that always pulls me deepest into the late-night quiet is his relationship with Thomas Becket, a relationship that begins with warmth and ends with a silence so heavy it seems to dampen the air around me every time I recount it. Henry chooses Thomas to be his chancellor, and at first there is harmony between them, the kind of ease that can only exist between two men who share both ambition and intellect. I imagine them walking together through corridors lit by long rows of torches, their voices low, their plans expansive, their trust so natural it feels unbreakable. When Henry later appoints Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury in the year 1162, he believes he is placing a loyal friend in the most powerful religious office in the land. He expects partnership. He expects unity. He expects the continuation of their shared vision. But the night always changes when I reach this moment. The room around me seems to grow cooler, as though the temperature drops simply because history itself is preparing for a fracture. For once, Thomas becomes Archbishop. Something shifts inside him, a shift that Henry cannot control and cannot fully understand. Thomas transforms from royal ally to guardian of the church's independence, and in that transformation, the bond between the two men begins to fray. I imagine Henry pacing alone in his chambers, struggling to recognize the friend he once trusted without hesitation, while Thomas kneels in candlelit chapels, torn between loyalty to a king and loyalty to the institution he now leads. The silence between them widens slowly, painfully, like a crack spreading through stone. Their conflict grows deeper through the years, and whenever I tell this part of the story at night, I feel myself slowing down even more, letting each detail settle before moving to the next. The quarrels over legal jurisdiction, the disagreements over clerical privilege, the moments of anger that leave Henry's voice echoing down the corridors, all of it builds toward a tension that seems almost unbearable. And then comes the moment that has haunted centuries a night in the year 1170, when Henry's frustration spills into words he never intended to become a command. In my mind, his exclamation misunderstood, overheard, or perhaps repeated with a fatal lack of care travels through the cold palace halls like a loose spark. 4 knights hear it. They ride to Canterbury. This is always the part where I fall into near whisper. Even in my own thoughts, I picture the great cathedral at dusk, its arches towering in shadow, the stone floor cold beneath the approaching footsteps. Thomas stands at the altar, surrounded by the wavering glow of candles. The knights confront him. There is shouting, confusion, a desperate attempt to pull conflict back from the edge, and then an act of violence that history remembers even when retold softly. I do not linger on the blood. I linger on the sound, the echo of metal striking stone, the extinguishing of candles. The stillness that follows, deeper than any silence a cathedral should ever hold. And Henry, upon hearing of what happened, breaks. I have always imagined his grief as heavy and suffocating, the kind that drives a man to walk barefoot to Canterbury to seek forgiveness, the kind that clings to him for the rest of his life. The king who rebuilt a kingdom discovers that some fractures cannot be repaired. Not with power, not with time, not even with remorse. That knowledge settles over him like a mantle he did not choose. Yet, even with this weight inside him, Henry continues to rule with strength unmatched in his age. He becomes, in time, the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, his empire stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. But power at that scale carries shadows of its own, and even as Henry's public world grows stronger, his private world begins to fall apart. His sons, restless and ambitious, look upon their father's vast dominion and see not stability, but opportunity. And in their longing for power, they light the sparks of rebellion that will torment Henry in his later years. As the quiet of night deepens around me, I feel Henry's presence slip gently toward that darker chapter of his life, one marked not by political turmoil, but by the heartbreak only family can inflict. And so part 5 draws to a close, leaving me on the threshold of a story where kingship becomes a burden too heavy, even for the strongest of men. When I let the weight of Henry II's grief settle at the end of part 5, I always feel a different kind of heaviness rise to replace it, not the sharp pain of losing a friend, but the slow, aching pressure that only family can inflict. It is a heaviness that does not fall all at once. It creeps, it coils, it gathers in corners, waiting for its moment. And as the room grows quieter around me, I sense the next chapter of Henry's life taking shape like a distant storm, the kind that rolls across the horizon in soft gray waves long before a single drop of rain is felt. This storm has a name, though it is made of several Henry Richard, Geoffrey, and later even John the King's own sons, the boys he raised, the heirs he hoped would continue the order he spent years rebuilding. I often imagine Henry II in the later years of his reign, still powerful, still sharp, but carrying something tired in the way he moves. His empire stretches from the borders of Scotland to the warm fields of Aquitaine, a span so vast that even the most skilled ruler would struggle to hold it together without strain. And perhaps this is where the trouble begins, not in malice, but in the sheer weight of a world too large for one man to hold and too tempting for young heirs to resist. Henry gives his sons titles, responsibilities, glimpses of power, hoping to guide them gradually into their futures. But in doing so, he gives them a taste of authority before they understand the burden that comes with it, and the taste becomes hunger. The year is 1173 when the tension finally breaks. I always picture Henry sitting in a dim, fire-lit chamber, maps spread across the table, the crackle of the hearth the only sound for several long breaths. Outside, the winter wind rattles the shutters. Inside, whispers swirl his eldest surviving son, also named Henry and known to history as Henry the Young King, has grown restless, crowned during his father's lifetime but given no real power. The young Henry feels caged. I imagine his youth burning hot inside him, the desire to rule, the desire to be more than a decorative heir. And in that burning, he becomes easy for ambitious nobles to influence. When the rebellion erupts, it does so with a swiftness that always makes me inhale sharply, even in the comfort of my own room. The young Henry allies himself with his equally fiery brother Richard, the future Richard the Lionheart, and with their clever brother Geoffrey. They do not stand alone. The King of France joins them. So do rebellious nobles in Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. It is as though the entire realm, still bearing old scars from the anarchy, shudders awake to conflict once more. And at its center stands Henry II, father, king, reformer facing a war not against rivals or invaders, but against his own blood. Whenever I reach this part of the story, I feel something tighten in my chest, a quiet grief that mirrors the one Henry must have felt. To be betrayed by strangers is painful, but to be betrayed by your children is a fracture that runs deeper, one that echoes in every direction of a man's life. I imagine him riding through rain-soaked fields, messengers delivering grim news, his thoughts circling not around strategy alone, but around the bewildering ache of wondering how the sons he loved could raise their swords against him. And yet, Henry fights, not with desperation, but with the steady resolve that has always defined him. He wins. The rebellion collapses. His sons kneel and ask forgiveness, and Henry lifts them up because he is still a father, and fathers, even wounded ones, often forgive too easily. But peace does not last. It never does in these late chapters of Henry's life. The sons who rebelled once will rebel again. Jealousies grow, suspicions deepen. Henry the young king, still desperate for glory, demands a share of power larger than his father can allow. Richard, proud and fierce, distrusts both father and brothers. Geoffrey schemes with the cleverness of a man who knows he will never rule but intends to shape those who do. Even John, the youngest, begins to stir, drawn into the political gravity of his family's unrest. And Henry, older now, wearier, the lines on his face more deeply carved than before, tries to hold them together. He tries to hold his kingdom together. He tries to hold himself together, but the cracks widen. Year by year, rebellion by rebellion, the weight becomes nearly unbearable. One by one, fate steps in. Henry the young king dies in the year 1183, taken by illness rather than battle. It is a death that strikes Henry II more deeply than even the rebellions, for it is a reminder that the love he still held for his son had no power to protect him. Geoffrey dies in the year 1186, crushed in a tournament, and now only two remain: Richard, who has become both brilliant and unyielding, and John, who moves like a shadow at the edges of the story. But the true breaking point comes not from either son alone, but from the betrayal that Henry never expected. Richard allies himself with the King of France once more, and in the conflict that follows, Henry is forced farther and farther back until the weight of age. Sorrow and exhaustion presses him into a kind of surrender. And then the blow lands. A list of the rebels fighting against him is placed in Henry's hands. And on that list, he sees the name of John the youngest, the one he loved best, the one he trusted longest. Each time I reach this moment, the silence in my room feels sharper. I always imagine Henry's breath faltering, the light dimming in his eyes, a lifetime of strength collapsing under the knowledge that betrayal has come not just from one son, but from them all. He does not recover from this. Henry II dies in the year 1189, worn down not by his enemies, but by the relentless conflict within his own family. As he lies in his final hours, I picture him surrounded by shadows that once would have fled from his command. Now they linger, quietly, like memories he cannot escape, memories of the kingdom he rebuilt, the friend he lost, the sons he tried to raise, and the fractures he could never mend. When his life fades into silence, the room around me seems to grow still, as though the story itself is pausing to breathe before moving forward again. And in that stillness, but only faintly at first, I feel the presence of Richard I taking shape, the brilliant warrior, the restless prince, the Lionheart whose fire will lead the next chapter far from England's shores. When the final breath of Henry II fades into the shadows of history, I always feel a brief stillness, as though the story itself must pause before allowing the next figure to step forward. And then, slowly, almost reluctantly, Richard appears. He does not arrive the way his father did, with the presence of a man who intends to rebuild what is broken. Nor does he appear like Stephen, hesitant and uncertain. Richard I, the man later called Richard, the Lionheart, enters my thoughts like a flame. Not the wild and unpredictable fire that burned inside William II, but a sharper flame, one that moves with purpose, illuminating only the path directly ahead and leaving everything else in darkness. It is the year 1189 when he becomes king, and even in the quiet of my room, I can sense immediately that Richard does not feel anchored to England in the way a king is expected to be. His heart beats for distant places. His destiny lies under hotter suns. I imagine him standing at the edge of the Channel shortly after his coronation, the wind tugging at his cloak, his gaze fixed not on the land behind him, but on the horizon, where the stories of crusades and holy wars glow like embers, waiting to be stirred. Richard is a warrior in the deepest part of his being, and when I think of him in these soft, late-night hours, I always sense the tension between the crown on his head and the longing in his soul. England is his by blood and by duty, but the Holy Land calls to him with a force that feels almost ancient, almost mythic. And so, soon after taking the throne, he answers that call, leaving a kingdom still fragile from years of familial strife and political uncertainty. Whenever I recall his departure, I picture England watching him go with a mixture of awe and unease. There is admiration for his strength, his courage, his fierce, undeniable charisma. Yet beneath that, there is a quiet fear, the fear of being left behind, the fear of a ruler whose footsteps lead away from home rather than toward it. I imagine the docks crowded with soldiers preparing for the long journey, their armor glinting weakly beneath a pale sky, the scent of salt and tar mingling with the tension in the air. Richard walks among them like a man born for battle, not for administration, his stride purposeful, his shoulders squared. And as his ship pulls away from the shore, the waves seem to erase his connection to England inch by inch. The Third Crusade begins, and with it a chapter of Richard's life that feels strangely far removed from the English soil he never truly loved. In my mind, he moves through the heat of the Levant like a figure carved from legend, a king wrapped in chainmail, his sword gleaming beneath an unrelenting sun. Tales of Acre, Arsuf, and Jaffa drift through my thoughts like fragments carried on warm wind, and though I tell them softly, I can never quite remove the sense of distance that clings to them. Richard's victories echo in the desert air, not on the fields of his own kingdom. His triumphs are sung by men who march beneath foreign constellations. Even the dust beneath his feet belongs to another world. Yet beneath the glory, there is something else, something quieter, something more human. I often imagine Richard in the stillness between battles, sitting in a tent lit by a single oil lamp, the canvas walls trembling with desert winds. In these solitary hours, the weight of kingship must settle on him differently than it did on Henry II. Richard does not struggle with betrayal from his sons. He struggles with the knowledge that he has given his heart to a war far from home, and that England, left behind, bends under the strain of taxation, absence, and political uncertainty. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, works tirelessly to hold the realm together in his name, her presence the invisible thread preventing the kingdom from fraying completely. And each time I recall her efforts, I sense the strange irony of Richard's reign. The king is absent, yet the kingdom endures because of those who remain. And then, of course, comes the journey home, the long, perilous return that feels more like a trial than a triumph. It is the winter of the year 1192 when Richard is captured in Austria, taken hostage by Leopold of Babenberg. I always feel the air around me grow colder when I reach this part of the story, as though Richard's imprisonment casts a literal chill across the memory. I picture him alone in a stone chamber, the walls damp, the torchlight dim, the echo of foreign voices carrying down narrow corridors. For a king who lived for the open battlefield, for movement, for the freedom of distant lands, captivity must have felt like a kind of suffocation. England strains under the burden of ransoming its absent king. Heavy taxes, public suspicion, political maneuvering by Richard's brother, John, whose ambitions grow louder in his siblings' absence. And through it all, Eleanor fights once more, a woman well into her 70s, riding through harsh weather, negotiating with kings and emperors, refusing to let her son disappear behind prison walls. Whenever I think of Richard's release in the year 1194, I imagine the sound of a lock turning, a heavy door opening, and a man stepping out into the cold air with relief that is almost palpable even across the centuries. But even after returning to England, Richard does not stay. His true realm, the one he feels in his bones, lies across the channel. And so he crosses into his French territories once more, waging campaigns, defending borders, moving restlessly through landscapes that feel more like home to him than the island kingdom he rules. The end of his life comes not on a battlefield, but at the siege of Chalus in the year 1199. A crossbowman wounds him, and though the injury seems minor at first, infection spreads. I imagine Richard lying in a dim stone chamber as the wound worsens, the glow of torchlight reflected in his fading eyes, the fire that once drove him flickering weakly in his final hours. He dies far from England, a king whose heart belonged always to war and whose body never truly felt rooted in the land he ruled. When Richard's presence dissolves into the silence of my thoughts, I feel the story shift again, more abruptly this time. For the next figure to step forward is John, the son who betrayed his father, the brother who schemed in the shadows, the king whose reputation will become one of the darkest in England's memory. And as his shape begins to take form in the dimness, I inhale slowly, preparing myself for a chapter filled with uncertainty, unrest, and the slow unraveling of a dynasty once held together by iron and will. When the memory of Richard I finally dims, slipping away like the last ember of a fire that once burned too brightly, I always feel a different kind of presence forming in the dark. It is not the vibrant blaze of a warrior king, nor the steady resolve of a ruler rebuilding a broken realm. It is something heavier, more hesitant, almost like the sound of footsteps approaching across wet ground. And then, slowly, John steps forward. His face does not carry the confidence of his ancestors. Instead, it carries a tension I can almost feel through the quiet of my room. It is the year 1199, and as he becomes king, the air around the story seems to thicken, as though England itself senses the storm about to gather. Whenever I let John's figure settle into my thoughts, I feel the weight of everything that came before pressing down upon him, the brilliance of his brother Richard, the legacy of Henry II, the vast and restless empire he inherits. And yet, beneath all that weight, there is something hollow inside John, something unresolved. He is intelligent, yes, but his intelligence moves in tight circles, twisted by suspicion and insecurity. I often picture him pacing alone through dim corridors of royal chambers, the torchlight flickering against stone walls as his mind turns inward, always searching for threats even where none exist. It does not take long for the cracks to appear. John's reign begins with loss, the kind of loss that feels inevitable the moment one recalls his nature. In my retellings, the year 1200 folds over him like a dark cloak as he loses Normandy to the King of France, a blow that cuts not only into England's territory, but also into John's pride. I imagine him gripping the edge of a wooden table in his chamber, staring down at scattered maps, watching the lands his ancestors fought for slipping away in ways he cannot reverse. It is during these moments that I always sense the turbulence inside him deepening, spreading like a stain across everything he touches. And then there is his relationship with the barons, a slow, steady deterioration that grows heavier with each passing year. John taxes them relentlessly, not with the steady vision of a king who understands his realm, but with the desperation of a man trying to fill a void he cannot name. I picture the barons gathering in cold stone halls, their voices low, their patience fraying. They exchange glances that hold more meaning than their words, glances that ask how long they must bear a king who trusts no one and demands everything. The tension grows thick, like fog rolling across a field before dawn, until even the smallest spark might ignite it. But the darkest part of John's reign settles not in his political failures, but in the way he moves through his own kingdom. I often imagine him traveling from castle to castle, the air around him heavy with unease, courtiers watching him with cautious eyes. He lashes out at those he suspects. He punishes swiftly. He bargains foolishly. And with each misstep, he buries himself deeper into the shadow of his own making. Even the church turns against him. And when he quarrels with the Pope, England slips into a spiritual darkness that feels almost tangible when I recount it in the stillness of night. Churches fall silent. Bells stop ringing. The kingdom holds its breath. All of this, the taxes, the suspicion, the losses, the quarrels, leads inevitably to Runnymede in the year 1215, a place I always picture as a wide, quiet meadow where the river moves lazily beside a gathering of men who are anything but calm. The barons stand firm, their patience exhausted, their demands clear, and John the King, who has spent years drowning in his own anxieties, finds himself cornered. I imagine the wind rustling through the grass as he stares at the parchment placed before him. The Magna Carta, a document that seeks not to destroy his kingship, but to place boundaries around it. Boundaries he has never known how to respect. In the soft, late-night rhythm of my thoughts, I watch him sign it. His hand does not tremble out of humility. It trembles out of anger, humiliation, and fear. The Magna Carta is not a triumph for him. It is a surrender, a confession he never wished to make. And as his seal presses into the wax, I always feel a strange stillness settle across the story, as though England, for the first time in many years, can finally exhale. But John does not find peace after Runnymede. His nature will not allow it. He tries to break the agreement. He fuels more conflict. The barons rise again. Foreign forces press into England, and John, who has spent his reign mistrusting everyone around him, now finds himself truly alone. It is in these final years that I sense him most clearly, not as the monster his reputation often paints, but as a deeply flawed, deeply fearful man who never learned how to carry the crown he inherited. His death in the year 1216 comes quietly. I often imagine him lying in a chamber at Newark Castle, the rain tapping softly against the windows, the torches burning low. His body is weakened, his spirit exhausted, and the kingdom he leaves behind is fractured but ready to heal under new leadership. There is no dramatic ending for John, no grand bow, No final proclamation, only silence, and the faint echo of a life that might have been different if fear had not been his constant companion. And as his presence slips away from my thoughts, dissolving into the same shadows that claimed so many kings before him, I feel a different kind of light forming at the edge of memory, the steady, measured glow of his son, Henry III, a child king who will be guided by wiser hands as England crawls slowly out of turmoil and into a new chapter shaped by Parliament, reform, and the long arc of stability. When the last traces of King John fade into the darkness of my thoughts, I always sense a strange kind of quiet settling over the story, a quiet not born of exhaustion like during the anarchy, nor of fear like the years under John, but of possibility, a gentle, tentative possibility, as though England itself has paused to decide what shape it wishes to take next. And it is through that quiet that a small, almost fragile figure begins to emerge. Henry III, a boy of just 9 years old in the year 1216, crowned not in triumph but in necessity, because the kingdom cannot bear another moment of leaderless uncertainty. Whenever I picture him taking the crown, the rooms of my imagination always soften at the edges, as though even history itself wishes to speak more gently around a child thrust into such heavy responsibility. I imagine Henry sitting on a carved wooden chair, much too large for him, his feet unable to touch the floor, his eyes darting between the powerful men who now guide the kingdom in his name. In my retellings, he does not yet understand the full weight placed upon his young shoulders, and the soothing thing about this part of the story is that he does not need to, not yet. England is held together by guardians William Marshall, the legendary knight whose loyalty feels like a warm hand steadying the nation, and the papal legate who provides spiritual legitimacy at a time when the crown's authority hangs by a thread. Under their guidance, the country begins to breathe again, cautiously, like a wounded creature testing the air after a storm. As the years pass, Henry matures, though the softness that lingered from his childhood never fully leaves him. He rebuilds Westminster Abbey, surrounding it with soaring arches and vast stone halls that I always imagine blanketed in echoing footfalls and candlelight. There is something deeply comforting about thinking of Henry as a builder, a king who restores rather than breaks, whose love for beauty shapes the kingdom as much as his policies do. Yet even as he builds, political tensions simmer beneath him. The barons grow restless again, not from tyranny this time, but from Henry's inconsistency, his generosity to foreign advisors, his struggle to manage finances, and the quiet frustration that spreads through the noble ranks like a slow-moving crack in a glass window. The climax of these tensions comes with the provisions of Oxford in the year 1258, when the barons force reform upon the king, demanding shared governance and accountability. I often picture Henry sitting in a high-backed chair, listening to their demands with an expression that mixes hurt, confusion, and perhaps a trace of relief. A king who was never fully comfortable with power now finds himself compelled to share it. And though the struggle that follows is turbulent, there is something undeniably important happening beneath it all. The idea of Parliament begins to take shape. A new rhythm forms within the kingdom, one not dependent on the brilliance or failure of a single ruler. England, slowly, begins to build a political heartbeat of its own. The conflict culminates in the Second Barons' War, a brief but intense fracture that brings Simon de Montfort to the forefront. Whenever I recount this war late at night, I do not see it as a roar of battle, but as a tug of war between two different visions of governance, each pulling at the nation's fragile center. Montfort calls what many consider the First English Parliament, summoning knights and burgesses alongside nobles, and in this moment, I always sense the faint but steady pulse of something new, forming something that will long outlast any king. Montfort's revolution ends at the Battle of Evesham in the year 1265, and Henry III's reign settles back toward calm. He grows old. His son, Edward, rises with a sharper, clearer presence. And when Henry dies in the year 1272, I always feel a gentle sense of closure. His life was long, his reign imperfect, but he guided England out of the darkness his father had left behind and into a structure where kingship was no longer the only backbone of the realm. Then Edward the First steps forward tall, commanding, a king whose shadow stretches long across the land. In the stillness of my room, his presence feels firm, the kind that makes the corners of my imagination straighten, as though preparing for discipline. Edward subdues Wales, attempts to bring Scotland under his rule, shapes legal reforms, and strengthens Parliament's role. Yet even as I recall these events, I feel the shift in the air once more, for Edward's story is not just about conquest, but about the gradual shaping of an identity England as a kingdom aware of its laws, its boundaries, and its people. But history moves on, as it always does. Edward II's troubled reign drifts through my thoughts like a shadow struggling to find its shape. His defeats, especially at Bannockburn, feel heavy, as though the kingdom itself winces. His deposition and tragic fate echo quietly before fading into darkness. And then Edward III appears, a figure whose reign restores confidence, expands Parliament's influence, and leads England into the long arc of the 100 Years' War. In the soft rhythm of bedtime retelling, the war does not arrive as thunder. It arrives as a long, stretching horizon of conflict and chivalry, shaping the medieval world for generations. And as Edward III's presence settles, I always feel the story preparing itself for a moment of closing, not an abrupt ending, but a gentle one, the way a candle flame softens when the room grows still. The journey from William the Conqueror to Edward III spans nearly 3 centuries, yet in the quiet of night, it feels like a single continuous breath, rising and falling through conquest, chaos, reform, and renewal. By the time I reach this final part, the kings no longer feel like distant figures fixed in stone. They feel like shadows passing through a long corridor, each leaving behind an imprint, each contributing to the shape of the kingdom that will continue long after them. And in this drifting, soothing place where history becomes memory, and memory becomes something closer to dream, the story finally relaxes into silence. The 1,000-year journey continues far beyond this chapter. But for tonight, the echoes soften, the crown rests, the halls grow quiet, and England, shaped by the footsteps of so many, lies calm beneath the gentle glow of its long, unfolding past. When the last impressions of Edward III fade from my thoughts, leaving behind the echo of chivalric battles and the long shadow of the 100 Years' War, I always feel the story darken slightly, as though the candlelight in my mind flickers before adjusting to a new and uneasy chapter. And into that dimness steps Richard II, a boy king, delicate in bearing, artistic in temperament, and utterly unprepared for the ruthless weight of a crown that had once seemed so secure. It is the year 1377 when he becomes king, and although England has known turbulence before, the quiet that surrounds Richard feels different, as though the realm is holding its breath in anticipation of something it cannot quite name. When I picture him in the solitude of late-night retellings, I always see a slender figure dressed in rich fabrics, his expression soft, almost distant, as though he hears music no one else can hear. Richard loves ceremony, architecture, poetry, all the things that make a kingdom beautiful, but do not necessarily keep it standing. And as I watch him through the slow rhythm of memory, I sense how dangerously detached he is from the practical world his grandfather once commanded with brilliant force. His reign stumbles early. The peasants' revolt in the year 1381 crashes over England like a sudden, violent storm. I imagine Richard riding out to meet the rebels at Smithfield, his youthful courage surprising even those who doubt him. For a brief moment, he shines. And yet, that spark of bravery does not grow. It fades into pride, into stubbornness, into an almost theatrical belief in his divine authority. I often imagine him pacing through Westminster like an actor rehearsing lines for an audience that has long since stopped listening. As the years drift, Richard isolates himself. He banishes and punishes nobles he distrusts, replaces seasoned advisors with favorites, and treats dissent as treason. Each decision tightens the noose around his own throne, though he never seems to sense it. And then, as though fate has been waiting patiently for the right moment, Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's cousin, calm where Richard is impulsive, measured where Richard is proud, steps back into the story. When Richard seizes Henry's inheritance in the year 1399, I always feel a sharp shift, like a quiet room suddenly tilting. Henry returns from exile not just to reclaim what was his, but to claim the crown itself, and England follows him. Richard is captured, deposed, and eventually dies in captivity, a lonely figure, whose reign slipped through his fingers like sand he never managed to grasp. With his fall, the Plantagenet line fractures, and the House of Lancaster rises. Henry IV becomes king in the year 1399, and each time I imagine him taking the throne, I feel both strength and strain in the air around him. He rules with resolve, but also with the heavy knowledge that usurpers rarely sleep easily. His reign is marked by rebellions, illness, and guilt, a king constantly looking over his shoulder, even as he stabilizes the realm. But then comes Henry V, and the entire tone of history brightens. Even in the late-night hush of my telling, he becomes king in the year 1413, a young man of fierce discipline and unwavering conviction. I always picture him sharpening the edges of England's identity, steadying his soldiers with a single speech, and carrying the hopes of his kingdom across the Channel. The Battle of Agincourt in the year 1415 glows in memory like a distant torch, muddy fields, exhausted archers, the impossible victory that turns Henry into a legend. In these quiet, meditative retellings, Agincourt does not roar. It pulses slow and deep, with the heartbeat of courage, but legends rarely live long. Henry V dies young, in the year 1422, leaving behind an infant son who inherits not only the crown, but the impossible weight of his father's myth. Henry VI is gentle, devout, and utterly unsuited to the storm that begins to gather around him. As I shift into his part of the story, the room around me always feels fragile, as though the walls themselves might crack if I breathe too loudly. His long bouts of catatonia, his inability to command, and the growing frustration of the nobility form a soft but suffocating fog through which England begins to stumble. The losses in France mount, disorder grows, and in that vulnerability, a rival claim awakens: the House of York. I always feel the tension sharpen when Richard, Duke of York, steps forward, not with rebellion at first, but with grievance. Over years, these grievances harden into open conflict, and soon, the Wars of the Roses begin: white rose against red, cousin against cousin, a kingdom turning slowly upon itself like a great wheel grinding in the dark. Edward IV rises from this chaos, tall, charismatic, commanding. When he becomes king in the year 1461, I always imagine the kingdom inhaling sharply, startled by the sudden brilliance of a leader capable of both charm and ruthlessness. His first reign is interrupted briefly, then restored, and by the year 1471, he stands firmly as king. But death comes for him too, and with it the return of uncertainty. His young son, Edward V, reigns for mere weeks in the year 1483, a boy caught in the jaws of a political machine too large, too hungry. I always sense a chill enter the room when I reach this part: the princes in the tower, the silence surrounding their disappearance, the shadows that swallowed them before they had a chance to speak. Richard III takes the crown next, sharp-minded, resolute, but burdened by suspicion and legend. In my late-night telling, he appears as a tragic figure more than a villain, a man shaped by the brutal necessities of civil war. Yet his reign is short, and fate delivers its verdict at Bosworth Field in the year 1485, where Richard falls and the White Rose with him. The Wars of the Roses end, and out of the smoke and the quiet comes a new name: stepping carefully but decisively toward the throne. Henry Tudor carrying with him the promise of unity through marriage, peace through order, and a new dynasty rising from the ashes of a kingdom that had fought itself for too long. This is where the House of Tudor begins. When the dust of Bosworth finally settles in my thoughts, and the echo of Richard III's fall grows faint, I always feel a strange kind of quiet forming around me, not the uneasy quiet of rebellion or the heavy quiet of despair, but the almost fragile quiet of something new being born after a long season of suffering. And it is through that quiet that Henry Tudor steps forward. He does not look like a conqueror in my late-night imaginings. He looks cautious, deliberate, almost fragile himself, as though he knows that the crown resting on his head in the year 1485 is not yet secure, and that a kingdom torn apart by decades of civil war will take more than victory to heal. Whenever I picture Henry VII, I see a man who moves as though he is always listening for danger, for whispers, for the shifting winds of loyalty. His reign, beginning from that moment on the battlefield, feels like the steady tightening of stitches across a wound. He marries Elizabeth of York, binding red rose to white. And in that single union, I always sense the kingdom exhaling, weary but hopeful. Henry rebuilds the finances of England with the precision of a man who does not trust chance. He strengthens the crown quietly, cautiously, tightening its grip through law, marriage, and the slow accumulation of power. And though he rarely inspires affection in these nighttime retellings, he inspires something else: stability. After a century of turbulence, stability feels like a warm blanket pulled over a kingdom still trembling in its sleep. Yet every time I reach the end of Henry VII's life, a different kind of energy begins to stir, rising like heat from the edges of memory. His son, Henry VIII. If Henry VII governs like a man repairing a fragile vessel, Henry VIII bursts onto the stage like a flame that has finally found oxygen. It is the year 1509 when he becomes king, and I always feel the air around me shift sharply, as though someone has thrown open a window in a cold room and let in a gust of warm, unpredictable wind. Henry is young, handsome, powerful in both body and intent. In the soft rhythm of my bedtime narration, he is the king who fills every corner of the story, leaving no space untouched by his presence. I picture him striding through the halls of his palaces with a confidence that borders on arrogance, his laughter loud, his appetites enormous, his vision for England brilliant in its scale and terrifying in its consequences. He rules not just with his mind, but with the force of his desires, and the kingdom bends beneath those desires like metal under heat. His 6 marriages, retold slowly in the hush of night, never feel like scandal to me. They feel like a sequence of storms, each one reshaping the land beneath his feet. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. Their names drift through my thoughts like the phases of a single, restless moon. With Catherine of Aragon, Henry's frustration grows. With Anne Boleyn, ambition ignites. With Jane Seymour, consolation arrives. With Catherine Howard, disaster unfolds. With Catherine Parr, peace returns like a tired traveler finally reaching home. But beneath all of these marriages lies the deeper fracture, his break with Rome. The year 1534 stands in my imagination like a cliff edge. Henry severs the bond with the Catholic Church, establishing himself as head of the Church of England. He dissolves monasteries, redirects wealth, reshapes religion, and in doing so, he forever alters the spiritual landscape of his realm. Yet when I tell this part softly in the late hours, I do not hear shouts or see destruction. I hear the soft turning of pages, the echo of monks' footsteps fading down long corridors, the quiet shock of a world rearranged while no one slept. And then comes the final sigh of his reign. Henry growing older, heavier, more tired, the fire inside him burning slower but never truly dimming. When he dies in the year 1547, I always feel the room relax slightly, as though England is finally able to exhale after decades of living in the presence of a man too large to ignore. Edward VI follows a child with a mind filled by reformers. I imagine him sitting with tutors, his face young, but his expectations vast. In my quiet retelling, his reign feels like the sharp, clean light of morning, Protestant reforms advancing rapidly. Doctrines rewritten, the kingdom pushed swiftly forward. But his life is short. He dies in the year 1553, and with his death, the Tudor flame flickers uncertainly once more. Then for 9 days, Lady Jane Grey, poor Jane, steps unwillingly into the spotlight. In this whispered nighttime version of history, I always see her as a girl holding a crown she never asked to wear, her hands trembling, her thoughts racing, her fate sealed by forces far larger than herself. She disappears as quickly as she appeared, her 9 days swallowed into the soft gloom of memory. Mary I rises next, determined, devout, wounded by years of uncertainty. She restores Catholicism with a zeal that still burns hot in the retellings of her reign. And yet, when I speak her name in the slow rhythm of night, I do not hear cruelty. I hear desperation, a longing for certainty, a fierce attempt to restore what was lost. Her reign ends in the year 1558, leaving behind a kingdom weary from religious whiplash. And then Elizabeth enters, Elizabeth I, whose presence transforms the air around the story like a calm but powerful tide. When she becomes queen in the year 1558, the story brightens, not with heat, but with clarity. I imagine her standing tall, her eyes sharp, her mind disciplined, her will firm. Under her reign, England finds the golden age, a flourishing of culture, exploration, and stability. Shakespeare writes, Drake sails, poets craft words that still echo through time. Even in this soft bedtime version, I sense the world expanding, possibilities unfolding like petals in warm light. Her reign long, luminous, steady closes the Tudor story with a peaceful glow, as though the dynasty that began in blood finally ends in brilliance. And when Elizabeth's light slowly fades, the shadow of a new age begins to take shape. The Stuarts, the storm of civil war, Cromwell's cold intermission, and the restoration that follows. When the golden glow of Elizabeth I finally fades from my thoughts, slipping gently into the quiet edges of memory, the way a sunset sinks beyond the hills, I always feel the story hesitate before moving forward. It is as though England itself is uncertain of what should come next. The Tudor line has ended. The long, luminous reign of a queen without heirs has closed like the final page of a cherished book. And into that silence, the Stuarts step unfamiliar, foreign touched, and carrying with them a different kind of weight. And so, as the year 1600 begins to form in the dimness of my mind, I sense a shift in the story's tone, from bright certainty to something more fragile and unpredictable. James I, King of Scotland and now King of England, enters like a man stepping into a room that is not quite his. I imagine him looking around at the English court, its Tudor echoes still lingering in every corner, his footsteps careful, deliberate. In my quiet retellings, I never feel James settling fully into the English crown. Instead, I sense a man more comfortable with ideas than authority, more drawn to sermons and scholarship than the harsh mechanics of ruling. Yet his reign sparks events that flicker through the centuries, the union of crowns, the King James Bible, the uneasy mingling of two kingdoms that had long eyed each other with suspicion. And under his watchful but often distracted gaze, tensions begin to coil beneath the surface: religious disputes, political grievances, whispered doubts about the divine right he so firmly believes in. Then comes Charles I, stepping into the story in the year 1625. His presence always carries a strange softness in my mind, as though he moves through history slightly out of step with the world around him. He believes in ceremony, in dignity, in the sacredness of kingship. And yet these beliefs isolate him more than they elevate him. When I imagine him walking through the great halls of Whitehall, I can almost hear the distant murmurs of Parliament growing restless, the tension thickening like mist before a storm. Charles is not a man made for compromise, and the kingdom he inherits is no longer a place where unquestioned authority can survive. The conflicts build slowly at first, like the tightening of a bowstring disputes over taxes, over religion, over the very nature of governance, and eventually, inevitably, the string snaps. The English Civil War erupts in the year 1642, and in my late-night narration, it does not erupt with thunder. It unfolds like a long, cold winter fields trampled, families divided, loyalties tested in ways that cut deeper than swords. I imagine the quiet terror of those years, the sound of marching boots across villages that had never known war, the smoke rising from distant battles that changed the fate of England forever. And at the center of it all stands Charles, unyielding, dignified, tragically certain. His defeat feels slow, like watching a candle struggle against a draft. Captured, tried, condemned, each step a quiet echo down a corridor lined with uncertainty. And then comes the moment that always freezes the air around me, the day in the year, 1649, when England beheads its own king. I never imagine the crowd's roar, never imagine the drums or shouting. I imagine only silence, the kind that follows an act so unprecedented, so heavy, that even the wind seems to hesitate. The monarchy dies that day, and in its place rises something colder, harder, and strangely empty. Oliver Cromwell. In my thoughts, he enters like a shadow with purpose, a man forged not of crown or ceremony, but of iron conviction. The interregnum begins the years from 1649 to 1660, and England becomes a republic in name, but a stern, joyless machine in practice. Under Cromwell's rule, the kingdom feels stripped bare, its colors muted, its traditions dismantled. I picture shuttered theaters, dim streets, and a kind of spiritual dryness settling over the land. Cromwell himself is a figure of immense force, yet in these soft nighttime retellings, he seems more like a stone than a man, unyielding, immovable, and somehow sorrowful beneath the hardness. But even iron erodes. When Cromwell dies in the year 1658, the Commonwealth weakens, its foundations cracking without the weight of his will to hold them together. And into that vulnerability steps a familiar shape, not the man himself, but his memory, his lineage, his rightful place. Charles II, son of the king executed by Parliament, returns from exile in the year 1660, and as I imagine him stepping onto English soil, the tone of the story warms suddenly, almost shockingly. He is lively, charming, witty, and England, tired of severity, embraces him with relief that feels almost like laughter. The restoration begins. Theaters reopen, courts dance again. The scent of perfume replaces the scent of gunpowder. Yet beneath the merriment, echoes of past wounds linger. Charles II rules with a careful hand, balancing levity with political caution, knowing how fragile the renewed monarchy truly is. Then James II ascends in the year 1685, and once more, tension coils. His Catholic faith alienates those who fear a return to absolutism, and within 3 years he is driven from the throne in a quiet but decisive shift known as the Glorious Revolution. William III and Mary II rule together, their reign marking the moment when Parliament finally stands above the crown, shaping the future constitutional monarchy that England will carry forward. After them comes Queen Anne in the year 1702, her quiet strength guiding England through war and union, and with her death in the year 1714, the Stuart line ends, the crown passing into new hands, the House of Hanover, waiting patiently across the sea. And in that transition, as the Stuarts fade and the Hanoverians rise, the story prepares to stretch once more into new centuries, centuries that will carry England toward empire, industry, and the long, commanding shadow of Queen Victoria. When the final whispers of Queen Anne drift out of my thoughts, leaving England standing at the fragile edge between one dynasty and the next, I always feel the story take on a new texture, as though the air grows cooler and the rhythm becomes steadier. The Stuarts have ended, their long and tumultuous line folded quietly into the past, and now across the water, the next chapter waits the House of Hanover, foreign by blood, unfamiliar by nature, and yet destined to shape the kingdom for more than a century. And as the year 1714 emerges softly in the dimness of my mind, I watch George I step onto English shores with the cautious gait of a man entering a home he has inherited but not yet earned. He arrives from Hanover with limited English, a foreign court, and a mind more accustomed to the steady order of German principalities than to the restless pulse of London. In my late-night telling, I always imagine him walking through the corridors of his new palace with a quiet reserve, listening to advisors translate not just words but customs. His reign marks something subtle but decisive, the shift of real power from sovereign to parliament, and George I, perhaps by temperament or necessity, does not resist. He allows ministers to govern, allows parliament to grow, and in that slow seeding of authority, England begins its transformation into a constitutional monarchy, a system where the crown glows more as symbol than as command. When George I fades from memory and George II rises in the year 1727, the transition feels smooth, almost effortless, like a river continuing its course. George II brings energy, military focus, and the distinction of being the last British monarch to lead troops in battle, the Battle of Dettingen, in the year 1743. Yet when I imagine him in these quiet hours, I do not see him on horseback, but in palaces filled with the soft rustle of silk and the low murmur of political negotiation. His reign feels like an empire beginning to stretch in the distance, its outlines still faint but steadily sharpening. And then George III enters, a figure whose presence always causes the room around me to settle, as though preparing itself for a story both expansive and intimate. He becomes king in the year 1760, and in the hush of my narration, I feel the weight of a man who tried, with earnestness and restraint, to be both moral and strong. His reign is long, one of the longest in British history, filled with triumphs and tragedies that unfold like tides. Under him, the American colonies slip away, the Napoleonic Wars rise and fall, and the British Empire expands in places untouched by earlier kings. Yet his story carries a deeply human ache, the slow, heartbreaking descent into mental illness. The shadows that close around his mind, even as the empire he governs continues to grow. In my retellings, this decline is never abrupt. It is a soft, painful fading of clarity, like a candle flickering against a draft. When he withdraws from public life, his son takes his place as Prince Regent, and soon after, as George IV. If his father was dutiful and restrained, George IV is extravagant, restless, and alive with artistic excess. I often picture him wandering the lavish halls of the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, rooms glittering with colors and patterns that feel almost surreal in the quiet of midnight storytelling. Yet beneath the grandeur lies instability, political turmoil, personal excess, the kind of brilliance that dazzles briefly before dimming. His reign ends in the year 1830, and William IV rises next, a king older than most at their coronation, carrying the air of a man who has lived more years at sea than on land. He is practical, modest, almost unexpectedly earnest, and though his time on the throne lasts only until the year 1837, it marks something significant: the Reform Act of 1832, expanding the electorate and shifting the nation toward a more democratic future. In the dim light of my imagination, I see his reign as a narrow bridge between the fading world of Georgian tradition and the immense horizon that waits beyond. Then the horizon brightens, not with fire, but with the dawn of a new era, Victoria, She becomes queen in the year 1837, and the tone of my thoughts changes instantly, as though centuries rearrange themselves around her presence. She is young, determined, steady in a way that feels almost gravitational. Under her reign, the empire stretches across continents, industries surge toward modernity, and British identity crystallizes into something vast and self-assured. And yet, in these soft bedtime retellings, I do not see factories or railways or colonial maps. I see a young woman becoming a symbol larger than herself, then a widow wrapped in grief, then a matriarch whose shadow stretches across the 19th century. Her reign, lasting until the year 1901, feels not like a chapter, but like an entire landscape enduring, expansive, filled with both brilliance and weight. And as Victoria's era closes, the story shifts once more, preparing for the 20th century, a century of wars, abdications, resilience, and a monarchy learning how to exist in a world that no longer bends easily around crowns. When the long reign of Queen Victoria finally slips into silence in my mind, lingering like the final glow of a lamp before it is turned down for the night, I always feel time accelerate slightly, as though England is stepping onto a different kind of path, one where history begins to move faster than the people living inside it can fully grasp. It is the year 1901, and the Victorian world, with all its certainties and structures, exhales for the last time. Into the hush that follows steps Edward VII, Victoria's son, carrying not the rigid solemnity that defined his mother, but a warmer, more cosmopolitan presence. A man who has waited nearly 60 years for the crown that now rests upon his head. I imagine Edward VII walking through Buckingham Palace with the ease of someone familiar with rooms he has never ruled from. His footsteps confident, his smile softening the atmosphere that had long been shaped by Victoria's austere reserve. His reign, though brief, feels like a deep breath, a period when diplomacy flourishes, when England's aristocratic social world glitters brightly, when the kingdom leans quietly into the dawn of a new century. It is a time of elegance layered over the faint tremors of change. And whenever I tell this part of the story, I sense how fragile the shimmering surface truly is. When Edward dies in the year 1910, the crown passes to George V, and the story grows heavier, as though the 20th century suddenly remembers its own dark intentions. George V is steady, reserved, almost austere, a king shaped not by salons or continental tours, but by duty. Under his reign, England steps into the storm of the First World War in the year 1914, and in my soft, late-night retellings, the war unfolds not with cannons, but with the distant thud of a world tearing itself open. I imagine him reading telegrams in dim rooms, each piece of paper carrying news no king should ever have to receive. Each decision pressing on a heart that carries not only the weight of a nation, but the sorrow of a generation. The world he knew does not survive the war. Monarchies collapse across Europe, empires crumble, and George V watches these changes with a quiet understanding that the age of unquestioned royal power has ended. It is under his reign that the royal family adopts the name Windsor, shedding its German identity in a symbolic gesture of loyalty to the British people. Whenever I reach this part, I feel the shift deeply, the monarchy bending, adapting, learning to survive in a world that no longer bows naturally. Then comes Edward VIII, stepping into the story in the year 1936, like a brilliant but unstable flame. He is charismatic, modern, deeply human in his desires, and disastrously mismatched with the expectations of the crown. I imagine him pacing through gilded rooms, wrestling with the choice between duty and love, feeling the pull of his own heart stronger than the weight of centuries behind him. And in the end, love wins. His abdication arrives like a quiet shock, not a thunderclap, but a moment that sinks into the national consciousness like a stone falling through deep water. A king steps down, not by death or defeat, but by choice, and the world changes once more. George VI rises reluctantly in his brother's place, shy, gentle, a man never meant to rule, yet destined to guide Britain through one of its darkest hours. When he becomes king in the year 1936, I always picture him sitting alone for a moment, the crown newly placed upon his head, the weight of responsibility heavier than he ever anticipated. And then the world breaks open again. The Second World War engulfs Europe in the year 1939, and George VI becomes not merely a monarch, but a symbol of endurance. I imagine him standing beside bombed-out streets, speaking with citizens who have lost everything, offering not solutions, but presence, a steady flame in a city shrouded by smoke. His reign is marked by hardship, by courage, by the slow unraveling of the empire Britain once ruled with certainty. When he dies in the year 1952, I always feel the sadness of his passing spread gently through the story, as though the candle that had stayed lit through the darkest nights has finally flickered out. And then Elizabeth steps forward, Elizabeth II, young, determined, stepping into a world that seems both hopeful and fractured. When she becomes queen in the year 1952, the story brightens with a kind of modern light, one made not of torches or candles, but of cameras, broadcasts, and the hum of an electronic age. Her reign stretches for 70 years, longer than any monarch before her, and in these quiet retellings I see her as a constant presence, a calm center around which a rapidly changing world keeps spinning. Empires end, nations rise, technology reshapes every corner of life, and yet she remains steady, composed, a living thread connecting the 21st century to a past that feels impossibly distant. Her death in the year 2022 brings a shift in tone that I always feel in my chest, a soft ache, a gentle closing of an era that shaped so many lives. And as the crown passes to Charles III, I imagine him carrying both the weight of history and the uncertainty of a future still unfolding. His reign begins in a world far removed from the one his ancestors ruled, a world where monarchy survives not by command, but by relevance, resilience, and quiet adaptation. And somewhere beyond him, just out of reach, a name waits like a faint silhouette, William V, a king not yet crowned, a chapter not yet written, a reminder that the story of monarchy stretches always forward, into the unknown. When the long reign of Elizabeth II finally fades from my thoughts, the way evening light slowly withdraws from a familiar room, I always feel time loosen again, as if the story is preparing to step beyond the part of history that has already been fully written and into a softer, more uncertain place. Her presence lingers like a steady heartbeat, 70 years of constancy, and when it vanishes into silence, the world she held together feels strangely weightless, suspended for a moment before the next chapter begins. And into that space steps Charles III, not young, not untested, but carrying with him the quiet resilience of a man who has waited a lifetime for the role he now must fill. It is the year 2022 when he becomes king, and in the stillness of these nighttime retellings, I always imagine him standing beneath the vaulted ceilings of Westminster Abbey, the crown newly placed upon his head, a heavy symbol pressing gently into the thoughts of a man who knows that monarchy in the modern world is not a throne to sit upon, but a tightrope to walk. Charles does not enter history like a burst of fire or a surge of force. He arrives like a steady breath, taken after too many years of holding one in. I picture him in his study, surrounded by papers, books, and the soft ticking of a clock that has watched decades pass by, his mind balancing duty with change, tradition with expectation. His reign is not defined by conquest or war or the rise and fall of empires, but by something far quieter, the delicate work of keeping an ancient institution alive in a world that moves faster each year. Climate, diversity, media storms, political division, generational shifts. These are the landscapes he must navigate. Landscapes far stranger and more volatile than any battlefield his ancestors ever knew. And yet, in these soft late-night reflections, I see him move through them with a kind of practiced patience, a steadiness refined by decades of waiting in the wings. But what always draws my thoughts most deeply is not the weight Charles carries now, but the faint, emerging silhouette of the future, a figure waiting just beyond the curtain of the present. William, the man who will one day be William V. His presence in the story feels like a quiet breeze, a reminder that monarchy, despite its ancient roots, is always leaning forward, toward people whose lives have not yet been lived, toward years that have not yet passed. I imagine William watching his father, learning not from ceremony alone, but from the gentler rhythms of public duty, a handshake in the rain, a speech carried by wind across a crowd, a visit to a hospital in the dawn light when the world is still waking. These small human gestures, not the grand ones, form the threads of tomorrow's history. The monarchy he will inherit is not the one Henry VIII commanded, nor the one George III defended, nor even the one Victoria expanded across continents. It is a quieter monarchy, a softer one shaped less by power and more by presence. And as I recount this in the late hours of night, I often imagine William walking through the halls of Kensington Palace or Windsor, the future settling around him like an invisible cloak, not yet heavy, but already taking shape. He is a bridge between tradition and modernity, between the world that Elizabeth II carried forward and the one that Charles III must navigate now. And beyond William, in an even gentler outline, stands George, the next generation, the next chapter, the next heartbeat of a story that has stretched from 1066 to the space just beyond tomorrow. I sometimes picture him as a child running across a courtyard, sunlight catching his hair, unaware that history is watching him with the soft, patient eyes it reserves for those who will someday carry the crown. Nothing is certain, and yet everything feels quietly possible. As I reach this final part of the story, I always sense the centuries folding themselves gently together: the Normans, the Plantagenets, the Tudors, the Stuarts, the Hanoverians, the Windsors, all of them blending into one long stream that moves like a river through time, changing course, widening, narrowing, bending, but always flowing, and now, standing at the river's edge. Charles III holds the present in his hands, while William waits for the future to summon him forward. And beyond them both lies a monarchy that will continue not because history demands it, but because people, in some soft corner of their collective imagination, still find meaning in a symbol that connects the living world to the long, shadowed memory of 1,000 years. And so the story does not end here. It simply settles, it breathes, it waits. The crown rests for a moment, not on a battlefield, not in a palace, but in the quiet space between centuries. And as night deepens around me and the last echoes of this journey drift into a gentle hush, I feel the soft truth that has carried the monarchy from William the Conqueror to the kings and queens of today. History does not stop. It only pauses long enough for the next heartbeat to begin. When I let the thought of William V drift softly into the future, still undefined, still a shape waiting behind the curtain of coming years, I often realize that the story is no longer only about kings and queens from centuries ago. It is also about the world that exists right now. The world I can feel even as I sit alone in the dim quiet, recounting these histories as though they were part of some long lullaby sung across generations. And so I turn my attention gently toward the present, toward the age of Charles III, and the kingdom he now guides through a landscape that none of his ancestors could have imagined, a landscape made of screens and satellites, of rapid change and quiet uncertainty, of traditions that must breathe carefully to survive the relentless pace of modern life. Charles III, a king in the 21st century, moves through public life not in the manner of his forebears who ruled through proclamation and presence alone, but in a world where every gesture is recorded, every word replayed, every expression interpreted in layers. I picture him walking through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, the same palace where Victoria once held court, where George VI steadied his voice during wartime broadcasts, where Elizabeth II spent decades shaping the monarchy into a symbol of endurance. Yet now the walls carry a new kind of echo, one shaped not by the rumbling carriages of earlier centuries, but by the soft hum of cameras, the glow of phones, the constant murmur of a world watching from a distance. When I reflect on him, I do not see Charles as a figure attempting to recreate the past. I see him as someone standing at the crossroads between what monarchy has been and what it might still become. He is a man shaped by long years of waiting 70+ years during which he observed, learned, absorbed, and quietly prepared. And perhaps because of that weight, his reign feels less like a thunderclap and more like a gentle, steadying hand placed upon the shoulder of an institution that must evolve without losing its center. I often imagine him sitting beside a desk filled with both handwritten notes and digital screens, the past and the present mingling just as they now mingle around him. In these late-night reflections, I sometimes picture the United Kingdom itself as a kind of vast, old house with rooms full of memories, each corner holding echoes of monarchs and centuries gone by, and Charles III walking through these rooms with the careful steps of a caretaker, aware that history does not respond well to sudden movements. His concerns the environment, community ties, cultural heritage may seem modern on the surface, but in their essence they are deeply old, almost ancestral, as though he is quietly trying to reconnect strands that have frayed across time. Yet the present era is not shaped by kings alone. It is shaped by the people, by voices that fill the public square in ways unimaginable to earlier generations. As I drift through these thoughts, I often sense the monarchy existing not as a towering force, but as a quiet thread woven through national consciousness. Surviving because it still offers something that cannot be easily quantified, a sense of continuity in a world that moves too quickly. A reminder that even when life speeds forward, there exist institutions designed to last longer than any single lifetime. William, the future king, stands within this atmosphere not as a distant heir waiting for his turn, but as someone actively shaping the monarchy's modern face. I imagine him moving through events with a calm, grounded presence, aware that the world he will inherit is one that requires honesty, accessibility, and the ability to exist not just as symbol, but as relatable human. There is a certain softness to the way people look at him, not the softness of indulgence, but the quiet hope that he represents a bridge into an era where monarchy feels both familiar and renewed. And beyond William, little George, a child now, a future many decades away, moves through schoolyards and family gatherings, without yet knowing that history observes him gently from a distance, not with the weight of expectation, but with a tentative curiosity. In him, the distant future feels like a soft, unopened book resting on a shelf, waiting patiently for the day it will be opened. But the present is more than kings and heirs. It is also a world that challenges the monarchy in ways that are subtle and relentless. Questions rise about relevance, about role, about symbolism, about cost, about the tension between tradition and modernity. And yet, when I consider all this in the quiet of night, I sense that the monarchy's survival has never depended on grand gestures or dazzling victories. It has depended on its ability to bend without breaking, to adapt without surrendering its core identity, to remain steady even when the world outside shifts like sand beneath a tide. Charles III's reign unfolds in a time of global uncertainty, pandemics, political divisions, economic pressures, shifting alliances, and in that environment, the crown becomes less a center of power and more a center of calm. I often imagine the king reading state papers late in the evening, the quiet hum of the palace around him, the trappings of monarchy softened by the humanness of the moment, a cup of tea cooling beside his hand, the distant footsteps of staff in the hallway, the faint creak of old windows in a building that has witnessed centuries. And then I think of the people, those who see the monarchy as a comfort, those who see it as outdated, those who feel nothing strongly either way. The modern monarchy exists inside this spectrum, navigating not with decrees, but with gestures, ceremonies, speeches, and the subtle work of presence, a visit to a hospital, a moment of silence at a memorial, a handshake offered to someone who has lost their home, their loved one, their sense of tomorrow. These are not the acts that will fill textbooks, but they are the ones that keep the crown connected to the living pulse of its people. In the present, the monarchy is less a ruler and more a reminder. A reminder that 1,000 years of history have shaped the island in ways that continue to echo, even now. And as I sit with this thought in the muted stillness of my room, I feel how the story stretches from William the Conqueror to Charles III like a long, unbroken thread woven through the tapestry of time. Each monarch, each era, each upheaval, each triumph, each quiet moment, all of it flows together, forming a lineage that feels less like a sequence of rulers and more like a long, breathing memory. And perhaps that is why, even now, even in an age of quick information and shifting identities, the crown remains. Not because it commands, not because it conquers, but because it connects past to present, present to future, memory to aspiration. A symbolic hearth in a world that often feels too cold, too fast, too fractured. As I reach the end of this extended reflection on the present, the story feels neither finished nor unfinished. It simply continues, like a candle that has burned through centuries but still gives off a small, steady flame. Charles holds that flame now. William will hold it next. And one day, far beyond my lifetime, George may carry it further. History breathes in long rhythms, not short bursts. And tonight, as I let the final images fade into the soft dark around me, I feel the quiet truth of the present settle gently across the span of 1,000 years. The monarchy endures not because time stands still, but because time, in all its relentless movement, still leaves room for symbols that help people remember who they are, where they came from, and where the next faint silhouette of tomorrow might someday lead. When the night grows quiet enough that even your own breathing seems to drift like a slow tide moving across the room, that is when the long memory of England's 1,000-year monarchy begins to soften and unfold. Not in the sharp, jagged lines of history books, but in a gentle ribbon of moments that stretch from one century into the next, as though the years themselves were lying down beside you, letting their stories blend together in the hush of sleep. If you let your mind rest for a moment, you can almost imagine a door opening somewhere far away, and through that door steps William I, arriving in the year 1066 with a calm determination that feels strangely steady even across a millennium. He builds his towering stone castles, draws the Domesday Book into existence under candlelight, and leaves the island transformed in ways no one could have understood at the time. But in these soft retellings, he feels less like a conqueror and more like the quiet beginning of a story that will stretch on far longer than he ever lived. And when he fades from view, it is as though the light dims just a little, and the next kings step forward one by one, like figures passing through a long hallway where the only sound is their footsteps on old stone. William II slips into the shadows of New Forest. Henry I holds the realm together with the stern patience of a man who understands that peace is a fragile thing. And Stephen stumbles through the long winter of the anarchy, the entire kingdom drifting in and out of balance like a tired traveler unable to find the right direction. Then Henry II arrives, determined and brilliant, restoring order with the precision of a craftsman. But even he cracks under the weight of family conflict, and the sounds of rebellion echo softly through the corridors of his story. Richard I shines like a distant sun, far away on crusade, more legend than ruler. And John follows him with a trembling shadow of his own making, leaving us with the gentle rustle of parchment as the Magna Carta is sealed at Runnymede. Not as a roar of triumph, but as a faint sigh of compromise in the evening air. Time drifts forward, and the Plantagenet kings appear, their stories woven with battles, long reigns, and quiet failures that swirl together like dust motes floating in a beam of morning light. Henry III rebuilding Westminster Abbey, Edward I imposing his will on Wales and Scotland, Edward II struggling beneath the weight of expectations he cannot carry, and Edward III pulling the kingdom into the rhythm of the 100 Years' War, a distant cadence of marching armies and rising ambitions that hums softly beneath the surface of the night as though the past itself were breathing. Then comes the unsettled figure of Richard II, sliding into fragility, losing his throne to Henry IV, and from there the crown passes to Henry V, whose victory at Agincourt glows faintly like a candle flame flickering in the cold wind of distant memory. But after that brightness comes Henry VI, gentle and overwhelmed, and from his hands the crown fractures again as the roses red and white lean into one another in quiet, relentless conflict until Richard III falls on Bosworth Field and the long civil night finally ends. And out of that silence rises the House of Tudor, beginning with Henry VII, cautious and deliberate, a man who seems to hold every decision like a fragile object. Then the great blaze of Henry VIII spreads across the kingdom, reshaping religion, marriage, and the entire framework of power, not with noise in this bedtime retelling, but with a low, steady hum that vibrates through the centuries. His children follow Edward VI with his bright but brief reforms, Lady Jane Grey flickering for 9 days like a candle snuffed too soon, Mary I stirring old faiths with quiet determination, and then Elizabeth I, whose long golden age glows warmly across literature, exploration, and the settling identity of a kingdom discovering itself through both struggle and triumph. When Elizabeth fades, the Stuarts emerge as though from a soft change in weather. James I stitching two kingdoms together. Charles I moving with a solemnity that feels almost fragile as tension gathers around him. Leading to the soft but profound silence of the day, England executes its own king. Then Cromwell arrives. Not with fury in this whispered version of events, but like a stark winter wind that empties the streets and hushes the nation, until the monarchy returns with Charles II, whose charm warms the narrative again, followed by James II, whose missteps lead to the Glorious Revolution, a transition that glides rather than crashes in this slow, dreamlike retelling as William III and Mary II reshape governance alongside Parliament, and Queen Anne quietly brings the Stuart line to its end. Then the Hanoverians take the stage, not loudly, but with the steady pulse of a new age beginning. George I adjusting to a foreign crown, George II watching Britain expand its reach, and George III witnessing both devastation and endurance as wars rise and fall, while his own mind slowly dims like a lantern flickering in the wind. George IV's extravagance sparkles faintly like scattered jewels. William IV steadies the nation with gentle hands, and then Victoria appears, her reign stretching long and far like a broad, calm river, carrying the empire into new territories and new certainties, the 19th century unfolding around her as though time itself is bowing to the length of her presence. As the 20th century approaches, the world begins to spin faster, the air shifting with unseen electricity, and Edward VII guides the monarchy into a modern glow, before George V anchors it through the storm of the First World War, his voice becoming a quiet beacon in a world reshaping itself through pain. Edward VIII shines briefly and tragically, stepping down with a softness that feels like the closing of a door you did not realize was open. And George VI steps forward uncertain but steady, carrying the nation through the dark nights of the Second World War with the quiet courage of a man who leads by presence rather than force. And then, like a dawn rising over the ruins of war, Elizabeth II begins her 70-year reign, her calm becoming a kind of national heartbeat, steady, familiar, guiding the United Kingdom through decades of change, loss, renewal, and transformation. And now, in the gentle hush of the present, Charles III carries the crown, not as a symbol of command, but as a symbol of continuity, a quiet thread linking the past to a future still turning in the distance, while William waits with the soft promise of what will someday be William V, and little George drifts even farther into the horizon of time, still young, still free, still untouched by the long shadows that history casts. And as all of these reigns, all of these lives, all of these centuries settle together in the dark around you, the story becomes not a timeline, but a lullaby, a soft reminder that time is long, that history is patient, and that even the loudest centuries fall silent when night arrives. And now, as the last echoes of the story settle into the soft corners of the room, and the long line of kings and queens drifts gently into silence, I want you to imagine the world growing very still around you, not cold, not empty, just beautifully quiet, like a great hall after the candles have burned low, like a library after the last page has been turned, like a coastline after the tide has whispered its way back into the dark. All the centuries we walk through together, the battles, the coronations, the storms, the triumphs, the shadows, the golden ages and the quiet years, all of them begin to fold themselves away, as though time were tucking its own memories into a soft, patient sleep. The crowns that once glinted under torchlight now rest in the gentle dark, no longer heavy, no longer demanding, only peaceful, like old stories settling onto a shelf. The castles and palaces fade into silhouettes. The voices of monarchs dissolve into the distant hum of history, and the long thread connecting William the Conqueror to Charles III stretches softly into tomorrow. No longer something to follow, just something to feel, a thin, warm line across the night, reminding you that every age, no matter how loud or bright, eventually becomes a whisper. You have traveled across almost 1,000 years, and yet here you are, in the very same quiet room where you began, breathing a little slower now, holding the weight of all those stories not as burdens, but as gentle shapes drifting in your mind, like lanterns floating across still water. Nothing urgent remains, nothing fierce, nothing restless, just the soft comfort of knowing that time is vast and patient, and that you are allowed, in this moment, to let go of every thought except the one that carries you gently towards sleep. So let the past recede like a shore sliding out of view. Let the present soften around the edges. Let the future stay where it is, unhurried, waiting in the wings just as William V waits in some quiet corner of the horizon. Right now, there is nowhere to go, nothing to do, only a long, deep breath that settles into your chest like warm light. And as the night wraps itself around you, may this journey, all the kings, all the queens, all the centuries become a single, soothing lullaby that guides you slowly downward, deeper and deeper, into a sleep as steady as a royal seal pressed into wax, as gentle as a crown resting on velvet, as quiet as a kingdom finally closing its eyes. Good night, and let history keep watch for you until morning.